Okay, so before we get into tonight's share, do you have any questions from previous sharing? Anything that you want to ask, or even related, not related, at least under the general, under the general category of kashrus?
No, just we have to get back into it.
Okay,
All right.
fine, no problem. Well, as always, feel free to interrupt if anything is bothering you. Okay, so the share tonight is going to deal with Zaya. Now, Zaya is steam, basically, and the question is, does Zaya transmit taste? That's really our question over here. We know that obviously, if milk and meat actually come into physical contact with each other and they're heated, then you're going to have a bus of a challah problem. But our question now is, what happens when you have steam involved?
So I was told I had a water thing that was hot and cold, and I asked the question if I could use the hot, for a milking, like let's say oatmeal. I mean,
Yeah.
it was, you know, and I was told no because the steam is going to go up, and then the next time you use that hot thing, the taste.
What hot thing? Just give me the case a little more clearly.
They have two faucets on it, one for cold and one for hot.
Okay. Where is this? In your kitchen?
I don't have it anymore, but I used to have it years ago. So this was where I used to live. So I asked if I use the hot water dispenser to fill up the bowl with the oatmeal that's in it, and it's a milky product. Can I use it for something else, like if I just had I don't know, maybe I said something like if I just had a meat meal and I want to use something parv and something like that, but there would still maybe the milk taste would still be there or something.
You're saying that the hot water is coming out of the faucet into the bowl of oatmeal, and the steam is rising and going back into the tap. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Okay.
And then there's a concern that you're saying that it's absorbed milchiks, and now you can't use that for fleischiks.
Right. That's
okay.
what
We're going to deal with that tonight.
Okay.
Okay, so good. That's a practical question then for you, and I'll hold off on the halacha until we get exactly to it. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch in Tzadi Beis Sif Ches says that if a pan of milk is placed in a stove under a pot of meat. Now, just to take a step back, the stoves in the time of the Mishnah were these structures. You've dealt with them because in Eliezer when we learned Kalim, but the stoves. And also, and on Shabbos, in the Mishnah in Shabbos, we also dealt with stoves. But basically, you've got imagine this sort of square contraption where you put fuel in it's a square hollow box, but like obviously heat resistant. So it's typically made out of clay, and it gets fired to get to make it solid and hard. And inside the receptacle, you put fire. You make a fire, and there's a hole in the top where the heat can come out, and you put your pot on top of that hole. Okay, so that's a stove in the time of the Mishnah. Okay, and now the scenario that the Shulchan Aruch is talking about is now we take a pan of milk and put it inside the stove, basically in the receptacle underneath, in that hollow area underneath. Somebody puts a pan of milk inside there where it's nice and hot. And there's a pot on top of it that's got meat inside it. So you've got a cholent on top of the stove. And somebody wasn't thinking, and they put a pan of milk underneath this pot. Now, if you recall from our last year, we had the situation described where a splash of milk went and hit the outside of the pot. Okay, and that caused all untold kind of problems because we have this view of the walls of the pot that they are permeable to some extent, and we don't know to what extent. So it winds up that we actually treat the thing as if it's entirely permeable, and the milk could literally go through the walls of the pot into the meat. Okay, so let's just to get back into the question. So the pan of milk is placed in a stove under a pot of meat. The zaya, the steam, will rise and be absorbed by the pot, rendering it aser if there's milk in the machmas. So if there's milk in the pan, the milk starts to steam, and the steam goes up and hits the meat, and now we've got this milchik taste coming in from the bottom of the pot. Okay, which is very reminiscent of the previous case that we dealt with the drop of milk hitting the outside of the pot. Okay, so the Ramah says that 60 is needed in the pot of food against the milk in the machvas. Okay, you only need 60 against the milk in the pan. Okay, and that's dealing when the machvas is uncovered. That's specifically if it's an open pan that's going in underneath it, and the steam is rising from the food itself onto the pot above it. Okay, and of course, and he also says, and we're dealing with a situation where the distance between the pan and the pot is so close that the point of contact on the pot remains yad soled isbor. So it's close enough that your steam is coming up, and as the steam comes up, it doesn't have a time to cool down. It condenses hot on the pot. However, if the zayah is not yad soled isbor, then everything is mutar. Interesting. So he's saying that this must be talking about where the pot itself is cold, because if the pot itself is hot, then of course you've got the same issue as you had before. If the pot were hot, it would be no better than having a splash of cold milk falling on the outside. So we must be talking about a situation where the pot itself is actually cold, and you've got hot steam coming up. So all the heat that we're talking about is coming from the steam. However, so to reiterate that point, if the steam is not yad soled isbor, then everything's mutar. It's basically just cold milk condensing on the outside of the pot. And therefore, he says, the Ramah says on this, it's permitted to hang meat to dry. That's biltong, right? If you're hanging biltong above your stove, which just doesn't sound like a good idea in general, but let's say somebody did this.
No.
Okay, it's permitted, he says. It actually says it's permitted lechatchila to hang meat to dry above pots of milk cooking on the stove, because we're not worried about the zayah. Because when it's above the stove, the steam is going up and dispersing. It's not in a contained area, and since it's dispersing, we're not concerned about the taste that it might or might not leave inside the meat. Okay. Furthermore, if the pan is covered, that's the milk pan, then everything is mutar, because such a case is no worse than two pots that come into contact on the stove. Now, again, I think I said in a previous shir that for the love of everything that is good, please do not put milchik and fleishik pots on the stove at the same time. Okay, it's technically mutar, but you're asking for trouble, because one little splash in either direction and things get very complicated. Okay, but if you had a milchik pot and a fleishik pot on the stove and they're covered and they're dry on the outside, even if the two pots touch each other, it's okay, because there's no taste transfer between a hot milchik pot and a hot fleishik pot on the fire, as long as they're clean on the outside and there's no liquid to affect any kind of taste transfer. Okay. So even if you had two pots literally touching each other, it's not a problem. And therefore, if you have a situation where you've got a covered pan inside the stove, it's certainly no worse than having that situation where it's covered and they're not even coming into contact. You're not really going to be worried about the steam that's coming out, right? Steam in general is only a problem when there's direct exposure. And we'll see this in a little bit more detail in a minute. Okay, so talking about the steam, the source of the halacha is a case that the Torah brings in the name of the Rosh. Actually, I'm going to skip this over here. There's a little bit of technical detail here, which we don't need to get into. We do have one of the poskim, the Dagul Merabava, who says that if you have a situation where you've got that the Shulchan Aruch describes, where the pan is open and the milk is going up and hitting the fleshika pot. He even ushers the pan underneath it. Why? Because the condensation hits the bottom of the pot and then it drips back into the pan.
Oh.
So he's going to usher both of them. Okay. So now there's also a discussion here about whether you've got a liquid or a solid that's the source of your steam. Okay, so the Pesach Tshuva says in the name of Pri Megadim that the steam of a liquid has the din of the liquid. But the steam that comes out of food does not have the din of the food that it comes from. Which means that if you follow this opinion, then even if meat is suspended over a pan, the meat is mutar. The meat is mutar if the isser in the pan is a food, even though it's giving off steam, and even though that steam is hot. So let's what kind of milchika solid would we have that might be making the steam? But let's say you're frying an egg in butter or something like that. So that's more of a solid, and the steam coming up. But apparently so according to this opinion, that steam would not have a din of the food, and it's not going to affect any meat that's above it. But the Achet Tshuva brings that many Acharonim argue against this din and hold that even by food, the steam has got the same din as the food itself. Okay, so his conclusion is that since we have this argument, it seems like there's a chiluk to be made over here, that steam from a liquid has got the din of the liquid min Torah, but steam from a solid is only midrabanan, got the same din. So in both cases we should treat it as aser. We should treat it that the steam even from a solid is we definitely shouldn't do that, to have a steam coming from a solid going into the other min. So from a steak that's frying on the stove or whatever onto some sort of milchiks above it, shouldn't that would not be allowed. But in the case where it was done, then the diavad, we look at it as an isur d'Rabbanan, not an isur d'Oraisa.
If you're melting butter, let's say, it's gonna cause steam. Eventually, that solid becomes liquid.
Right. So that's an interesting question. Does butter, the melted butter, now actually becomes a liquid? And I was thinking that as I was saying it, and that's kind of why I went into the egg, because I wanted the butter to get mixed into the egg, and make it into and make it more of a solid. Okay. So the Darchet Tshuva says that in the case of dry food, we don't worry about zayah unless we actually see that there is zayah. And this is actually quite an important point, as we'll see just a little bit later. It's going to be brought a little later. But remember that in general, when you have dry foods, we don't have to start worrying about steam coming off the dry foods unless we actually see that there's steam coming out of them. Okay, and that's also the opinion of Igros Moshe, that's Rav Moshe Feinstein. So, let's skip that point there. I'm not sure So if you're not, so Rabbi Akiva Eiger says that if you're not sure if the steam is Yad Soledispo, then you can rely on the fact that if there is place for the steam to escape, then you can be makil and assume that it's not Yad Soledispo, because once it's open, it spreads and it doesn't. The heat is not as intense.
It's interesting that you talk about all this steam, because they say, I mean, I've never done it, but they say if you kasha a microwave, you put a cup of water in there and it creates a steam.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's like it's almost like opposite of what you're
saying. No, but the microwave is closed. And that's really the point, is that you've got a closed environment where you put the cup with the water inside. Incidentally, it's a good idea to put something else in the microwave at the same time, because there's some interesting physics that happen when you microwave just plain water.
Really, I never done it.
it,
So
it can it can happen that nothing happens, and then the water suddenly just explodes in yeah. So
In the
there's just something very interesting about the chemistry of water, especially if it's distilled water.
what if you're heating like
I-
coffee?
I use tap water when I cash at the microwave for Pesach. I use water from the tap in a mug.
Yeah, that's fine. And I've never seen that. I've actually never seen it happen myself, but I have seen YouTube videos of what happens if you microwave distilled water.
So that's not coffee. Coffee or tea is something else.
No, your coffee and tea is fine because it's got other ingredients in it. But anyway, back to your koshering of the microwave. When you you boil it and the microwave becomes filled with steam, and that's really exactly what you're doing. I mean, as we spoke about microwaves before in a previous shir, the microwaves don't cook in the conventional way. It doesn't. If you just microwave something and you take your food out and you put your hand on the walls of the oven, it's completely cold. There's nothing, right? So it's not. It doesn't happen with heat. So really, the fact that we even kosher the oven, kosher the microwave oven with steam, is itself a chumrah. Me'ikra din, you probably don't even need to kosher it. You just need to clean it. But we do like to be machmir, especially when it comes to Pesach. So it's a good idea to do it. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying that if you actually look at the technicalities of it, you probably just really need to give it a good cleaning.
We have a milk again fleshik microwave. I just can't get my head around doing it I just don't do. We have two of them, and that's what we use. We don't use the microwaves in Pesach, so it's just something that bothers me about it. Just as it's me.
I hear you. And we're going to talk about ovens and having a milchik and a fleshik oven in just a few minutes. Now, it's a suffix. So now, here's an interesting one here. Spice containers. Aruch HaShulchan says that all of this only applies to steam that is contained within the walls of a pot or an enclosed area, but in an open area, for example, above the pots and our stoves, even if the pot and the steam are hot, the zayah doesn't answer anything that it comes into contact with. Okay, this is a major heter over here. That steam, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, and we paskin halacha a lot like the Aruch HaShulchan, being litvakim as we are. The Aruch HaShulchan was like one of the top poskim in Lithuania, and we very frequently follow his opinion. And he's saying that that steam only has the capacity to transmit taste if it's in a contained area. That means that, let's say you've got your chicken soup or meat soup cooking on the stove open,
right?
And somebody unthinkingly is like he's holding a piece of cheese in his hand and leaning over the pot, and he suddenly looks and says, "Oh my gosh, the steam has been going over my cheese over here." Nothing. Wipe it off and carry on eating the cheese.
Or he drops it in the pot.
Dropping it in the pot, then we have a different shaila. Okay. Nonetheless, even from the simple reading of the Ramah and the Bach, we see that if the zayah is yad soledis, or it's aser, even if it's not contained within the walls of the pot. So that's so what I was saying was the Aruch HaShulchan. Lamaaseh, don't do it, and we're machmir on this. We're more machmir than the Aruch HaShulchan over here. The psak of the Bari HaShulchan is that if the steam is actually hot, then we treat it as if it's actually aser. Even though the Aruch HaShulchan paskins lehatir, we're machmir on this. Okay. Here's an interesting one, which I've got a funny footnote over here, or comment that I've written in. Prima Gadim has a situation over here. It says if you have meat suspended over the stove for many days, then you have to wash the meat before you eat it, because we have to suspect that a significant amount of milk residue is condensed on its surface. Okay, for this reason, says the Prima Gadim, one should be careful with spice containers, not to use them over the stove for both milk and meat. So let's say you've got a salt shaker, and you come and you want to sprinkle salt into your soup, and the steam is coming up. So your salt's coming out, but meanwhile the steam is going into the holes of the salt. And then you're making some sort of milk tafshil. And you also sprinkle the salt over there. So now the milk steam is coming up into the salt shaker. Again, this is Aruch HaShulchan saying this is open. There's nothing to worry about here. But the Badei HaShulchan says you got to be concerned about this. And I have a comment over here that Rav Hanan says that in his opinion this is a bit OCD.
Wait, let me go through this again. You're saying that if you have a milk item cooking on one stove and a fleshik on another stove, and you take your salt and pepper and you want to put it in, and you're sprinkling it on the fleshik one or the milk, vice versa, then you can go to the other one. You're saying it doesn't matter, it's okay?
So the Badei HaShulchan says you shouldn't.
Right.
But the Aruch HaShulchan says it's fine. Just, you sprinkle in your salt, take it away. Sprinkle in your salt, take it away. So the Badei HaShulchan is concerned about accumulated residue. Eventually, it's going to reach a tipping point where it's enough to taste.
That's the other thing with the microwave. We have milk inflation, salt and pepper, things. I know this team is going in. I one time had seminary girls here one time, and some girl went to take the croutons and put it in the soup. And so she put it, and she went to put it over the soup, and the girl next to her said, no, we're not supposed to do that because the steam and all that stuff. It was interesting to hear her say that. So
Okay, so I'll encourage you to be machmir on this. There's no reason to not to be machmir. I mean, if you go ahead and do find that you're sprinkling salt over it, I wouldn't get too worried about it. But it's a good thing to do if you do have a habit of sprinkling your spices directly over your pot in the steam. Think twice about it. Just be conscious of the fact that the steam that's coming up there, according to some opinions, is a concern. Although again, you have a fallback position. The Aruch HaShulchan's got big shoulders, and if he says it's mutar, then it's mutar.
Can I quote you to my wife?
No. What? That the Aruch HaShulchan's got big shoulders.
No, the other one.
Okay. Now here's an important section. We were speaking about ovens.
I'm sorry. There's also a concern that if you are working with the spices, let's say you're spicing something before you're going to cook it, okay? And you're working on the fleshik part, and now your hands have meat on it, it has whatever as you were touching the meat, and you forget and you start picking up the bottle, and then later on you go to use that bottle again for something milky. That could be a problem, right?
Right. Okay. Worst comes to worst, you've got mixed meat and milk residue on the outside of the bottle, but you're not sprinkling the outside of the bottle. You're just sprinkling. I mean, I'm not saying you should do this. I'm just saying that it's not. You've got bigger fish to fry.
Because I'm saying you're the milky one now, but you have fleshik on the outside.
Yes, you should clean up your hands before you touch the outside of the spice bottle. Just from a hygiene perspective,
right.
Okay, but it's not a big deal. If somebody had slightly fleshik hands when they touched the salt, and then somebody else had slightly milchik hands and touched the salt, nobody's licking out the outside of the salt shaker.
You sound like my wife. All right.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it's also not something. It's not something that you have to get OCD about.
I mean, I know people who have milchik and fleshik ketchup, for example.
Yeah. I understand. You put it on the table, people handling things and whatever. I'm not going to knock it as a chumrah. If you want to do that, it's fine. But if you want to have a single ketchup that you use for both, and just make sure that you use your hands are clean when you do it, that's also good.
I only have one ketchup.
Yeah.
That's what I do. I just make sure that my hands are completely clean before I touch anything, regardless of whether I'm cooking milk or meat. With the spices, I'm washing my hands in between.
Right.
Yeah. That's completely fine. Okay, so ovens. Now, one of the most common applications of what we've been talking about is to do with ovens. So Now, what we've learned is that you can't use an oven for meat and milk, even one after the other, right? Why? Because if you have steam, so let's say you've put you had a cholent inside the oven, or some roasted meat or something, and it's got a gravy and there's steam and it all goes and gets stuck onto the walls and absorbed into the walls. So you have a taste. It's a closed environment and you've got steam, and now the steam goes into the walls. Okay. Now you bring, and then let's say somebody comes and takes, they take out the meat. It's all good, and even if they clean the oven off, okay, and now you take a pot of milk and stick it in the oven or something like that, okay. Steam comes out from the milk. It goes into it touches the walls of the oven, and because the oven is a ben yomo, so it's still got a fleishik taste in the walls. The milk comes into contact with that, absorbs a taste from the walls, and then falls directly back into the pot, into the milk. So that you can
absorb the taste of the meat.
I'm sorry.
The milk would absorb the taste of the meat from
Exactly.
that
Milk absorbs the taste of the meat from the walls of the oven and returns into the original pot. Okay. So if you only have one oven, which up until our generation is the spoiled generation where we can afford to have a fleishik and a milchik oven. Okay, but this is in previous generations you were lucky to have one oven. Okay, so what do? Well, you should designate it either fleishiks or milchiks, and that's your oven. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't cook. So let's say you've got a fleishiks oven, and now you want to make a lasagna. How are you going to make a lasagna? You've only got a fleishiks oven. Well, it turns out it's not that hard to do it, because as we've learned before, if you just cover it, then you don't have any chashash. You just make sure that it's covered, that even if steam does get out, it doesn't get back in.
Just wrap it in foil. Put it in a pot.
Wrap it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. You just have to wrap it.
Wow.
Okay. So you designate the oven. Let's say, well, we'll say that the oven is designated as fleishiks, and when baking milchiks, just make sure it's completely covered. Okay. So even if you want to cook parava that's going to be eaten with milk, you should also do that according to Ashkenazim. We don't, because we want to keep our paravas parav if we're going to have them with milchiks. Okay. Unless we're talking about dry food. With dry food, you can bake challah in a fleishiks oven and eat it with milchiks, or bake it in a milchiks oven and eat it with fleishiks. Challah is completely dry. There's no steam, so there's no reason to bake a challah in to be makbid about baking it in a fleishik oven just because you're going to be having it at Friday night supper. You can bake your challah in the milchik oven 100%. As a matter of fact, back in the day when Jews were living in the shtetl, and there's in a small little town, and there's only a small bunch of Jews, and the only baker in town is non-Jewish. So he's baking all his pastries, his pork pies, and whatever other chazarai he makes in his oven. He's got the big oven, but the Jews have got to eat bread somehow. So what do? They just have to send somebody in and say, look, we want to bake a batch of bread in your oven if you don't mind. He doesn't even have to clean it. Just make sure that the bread is on a kosher pan, because obviously it's going to absorb from whatever's in there. You can't have it on the same pan that the pork pies were on. Okay, but you can take a whole bunch of loaves of bread, stick them in the oven. As long as the oven is, doesn't have any actual like drippings of pork coming off the oven. We're talking about isser here. We're not just talking about like, possibly drops of milk coming in, making it milchik or whatever. We're talking about mamish treif ovens, chazer treif. But if you bake bread inside them open, you bake bread inside them open, lechatchila kosher. Okay, so there's certainly no concern about baking in your oven at home whether it's a fleishik oven or a milchik oven, as long as it's baked, on a pan that is actually parva. If you bake it on a fleishik pan that's got possibly residues of meat on it, okay, yeah, then you got other problems.
If my daughter makes cookies on a bar, puts it on a bar of aluminum tray and puts it in a milk oven, or puts it in a fleishik oven, I can either way. I can have it with in the morning have it with milk and coffee or something like that. And
if it's parva, it doesn't matter what oven you put it in.
well,
It's dry, it's parva. There's no concern at all.
I'm always asking her, how was this made? Can I have it with this or that?
Yeah, and it's quite entertaining. Like sometimes, somebody will give me, whatever, for whatever reason, if it's been a shalom zachar, or or somebody's just given birth, or somebody's sick, and the neighbors pile in, and there's a kiddush, and the neighbors say, these I baked these cookies for you. They were baked in a fleishik oven. I said, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what kind of oven they were baked in. If they're parva and they're dry, they're parva. Okay.
You're kind of blowing me away today.
Good. I'm happy to hear it. Okay, then the question of the two pots we spoke about. We spoke about the two pots coming into contact, and so we just like Gufa, we wanted to take a look at that. If the Chavas Das holds this is that even if the pots are moist on the outside, as long as the moisture is parva, so let's say water. So if you have a fleishik pot and a milchik pot next to each other, and there's water in between them, it still won't transmit the taste of the meat into the milk, or vice versa. As long as it's not the mamashas, what the contents of the pot. So if your pots are covered, you're in a little bit of a better position. If your pots are uncovered, please, again, don't do it. Just don't do it, because one splash onto the outside of the pot, and it's a mess. There's the Yad Yehuda who does argue that water will affect the taste transfer between the pots, but the halacha doesn't follow him. It follows that the water on the outside does not transfer the taste between the two pots. Lechatchila, the Rama says we should be careful not to let them touch, which is what I've been saying as well, because there are opinions that the blias come out of the kli even without moisture between them. Okay, but that's a din lechatchila, but diavad we say that there's no transfer. Okay. Now we've got about 5 minutes to do one more quick halacha over here, which is similar. If your candle is made out of chalev, chalev is an aser fat, right? You're not allowed to eat chalev, but you can make a candle out of it. Okay. Now chalev is also very, very treif. If you were holding the candle and the wax and the fat dripped onto a kli, okay, then the kli needs to be scraped off. However, if it's molten chalev, if the chalev itself is completely liquid, and you get a whole liquid splash of chalev onto a kli, then you need to kosher the whole kli. It needs hagala. Okay. So just in this point over here, we said that the din of we have in terms of the consistency of the heat, we have a kli rishon. So kli rishon is where things everyone agrees that the kli rishon is where it's hot, and this is where taste is definitely transferred, is in the first degree kli. Then we have the sheni, which is where things do not cook. Okay, even though things are hot, if something's in a kli sheni, we say this isn't a place where things cook. Even on Shabbos, generally things don't cook in a kli sheni, except for the kalei bishul, things that are very easy to cook, and the Gemara is full of all sorts of examples of what are the kalei habishul. I think nowadays we paskin that tea is one of the kalei bishul. Eggs, I think eggs. I would imagine that eggs are, but I don't want to overstep my mark over here. But in between the Kli Rishon and the Kli Sheni, we have the stream that comes out of the Kli Rishon. That's called Iroi Kli Rishon. Okay, and it makes a difference whether the stream is a continuous flow or whether it's dripping. So if the stream is a continuous flow, obviously that's going to contain a lot more heat than if the stream is kind of just a slow drip coming out of the Kli Rishon. Okay. So Iroi Shilo Nifsak Kiloach, if it that has a din of a Kli Rishon. So, and this, by the way, you see this when you are koshering your stove tops or particularly your sink. I mean, I kosher my stove top with a steam iron. Not the stove top, the countertops. For Pesach, I kosher my countertops with a steam iron. It's not so easy to get into the sinks with a steam iron just because of the shape and the walls, the vertical surfaces. So what do you do with that? You take boiling water from the kettle, the Kli Rishon, and you pour it over there. So but it must be Shelo Nifsak Kiloach. It's got to come straight out of the kettle exactly then, and that stream is still considered a Kli Rishon, which is good enough to kosher your sinks. Okay, it must be Shelo Nifsak. It can't be that it's splashed from one part onto something else. It has to hit the thing directly, so that it's so that it can actually kosher. Okay. Now that's what the difference is, that when you have a drip coming from this candle, that drip is not considered. That's considered nifsak kiloach. It's no longer connected to the Kli Rishon where it was. So it only ushers a small amount, and you just have to scrape off the Kli where it went in, where it touched.
People use a cliche.
Now this also has relevance. This whole sugya it's not so relevant when you're talking about candles, because who honestly makes candles out of fat nowadays? But more practically is the whole discussion of ladles. When ladles, let me ask you this question: if you have let's say you've got a nice big pot of boiling water, and you want to kosher your sink, but it's difficult to pick it up, to pick up the whole pot, and it'll make a big splash. Let's say you've got a ladle. You stick the ladle in the pot, fill it up with the boiling hot water, and take it out and pour it onto whatever you want to kosher. Is that as good as taking the pot itself?
No, it's isn't it a Kli Rishon then at that point? I mean, a Kli Sheni at that point?
Sheni. Right. So let me ask you the question. We said about we have this question. It's such a classic question about on Shabbos. You're ladling soup into your bowl. Can you put bread into the bowl? Because remember, bread is not cooked; it's baked. So there's still a concern of recooking the bread. You would not be allowed to put bread directly into a Kli Rishon. And it's possible. I think there's a discussion about whether the bread is whether it'll even cook in a Kli Sheni. It's possible that bread is one of the kalei bishul. So the concern over here is of putting things into a Kli Sheni. We're generally more machmir in Shabbos than we are in kashrus, actually. Is your soup bowl a Kli Sheni or a Kli Shlishi? And in general, we say that if the ladle has been sitting inside the Kli Rishon, then the ladle itself becomes a Kli Rishon.
But if it's going back and forth,
okay. And there are a number of reasons for this. The Mariel says that if a Kli remains immersed for a small amount of time in a Kli Rishon, it becomes a Kli Rishon. Okay. There's another case in the Gemara where on Shabbos, where Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says to his servant, go to the bath which is now Kli Rishon. It's heated water inside the bath, and use a Kli Sheni, he says, and then put oil into that. So if he's saying so what he's saying is, put in is he saying put in a ladle and take it out and make sure it's a kli? If a ladle is automatically a kli, why does he need to give him a specific instruction? What he's LMI, he's telling him the ladle is the kli rishon. Put it into a kli before you put the oil into it. Okay, so that's another proof of the fact the ladle is a kli rishon. And Tosfos explains that what's the main difference between a kli rishon and a kli sheni is that the walls of the kli sheni are cold, and they cool down the food or the liquid that's inside it. If you have a ladle that's been sitting in the pot, its walls are not cold. It's not cooling anything down, so it still has the din of the kli rishon over here. This, incidentally, comes up with an interesting problem: is that if a fly goes into your soup pot, like inside the kli rishon, if you now take a small spoon, and lift that fly out, you got a shaila here, because now your spoon that became a kli rishon inside the pot, and now the fly is possibly more than 1 in 60 against the soup in your spoon, and now you have a shaila that your spoon has been chafed.
Oops.
Yeah. If you find that in your soup bowl definitely is a kli sheni. So that wouldn't be the problem to ladle it out from there. But it's one of the questions that is asked over here. There's a lot of leniency over here because the fly is possibly a tamlif gum in the first place. It's not a pleasant taste, and therefore, and I think we've said before that bugs in general are considered a negative taste. So the custom, nonetheless, it's the custom is to be makel in the case of a hefsid meruba, and it's enough to just remove the fly because the fly gives off a bad taste. Is there another point that I just wanted to squeeze in over here? I know we're over time. So Taz is machmir that a ladle shouldn't be used for kashering by iroi. Okay, and the Kudas HaKesed agrees with the Taz to be machmir in this case. Rather, even though we've gone through all these arguments that why a ladle is actually a kli rishon, nonetheless there are people who argue on this, and therefore it's better to, if you want to kasher things, it's better not to use a ladle. Rather use it directly out of the original kli rishon.
In your question about the bread, does the same thing hold by croutons that people put in the soup? That's baked, I think.
This is a Shabbos question, not a kashrus question. I can't say that I'm expert in this, so I don't actually want to answer you on this point.
All right. It's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions?
No, I'm going to listen to this year again.
Okay, that's us then.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Have a good
Nice
night.
to see you both.
Mr. Shem, I will see you in the morning.
Okay.
Bye, Don. Bye. Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.